Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and today I'm going to give some public service education with regards to obesity. Obesity was a huge issue with COVID, but nobody seems to understand why. Now, what I'll be giving you is some insights as to why obesity was a risk for severe disease and death, but more critically, what are the risks going forward because the virus is still circulating? So, even though we have a situation where we don't see as much severe lung disease, is the reinfection with the virus putting people at different kinds of risk? That's what I'm predicting. And this is why I'm highlighting this important point. This was a comorbid pandemic where the comorbidities drove the severity of the disease. But our primary focus was vaccines and not general health. We need people to lose weight. But what I'll be giving you is the science as to why people are gaining weight. It's not just overeating. So that's a part of it. And you can see the food here. But even people who are eating the same amount or exercising are still gaining weight. What is the mechanism? What is the science? So that's what I want you to do at the end of this video. You need to register for this course. This time I'm being very direct. You'll have to pay for it, of course. But critically, for those people who are concerned about weight gain, you need to understand the mechanisms. And in that, critically at the end of this, I explain properly insulin resistance, which I'll mention now. I mentioned the food industry, trick with sugar, and critically, there are options available that can overcome the insulin resistance. So that's the bit that I want people to focus on. And that's why I think it's important. So now I'm going to take you through why I think this is such an important piece of the puzzle. So, as I said, this was a comorbid pandemic. Hypertension was probably the top comorbidity. Obesity was a huge comorbidity in the context of severe disease. Now, it's not that obesity is not normally associated with severity of disease, say with influenza and so on, but this was at a different scale. And to put it in context, what we had here was a paper. This was just published in June, and it was a meta analysis. And I'll show you here looking at mortality risk in patients with obesity and COVID-19 infection. They were looking at a number of studies. And what they found was that, before I go to that, you have to go down here. They included 199 studies from US and Europe. Mean age was between 41 and 78 years, looking at the variables, the prevalence of metabolic comorbidities. And what they found, the highlights from the study, COVID-19 patients with obesity. Now, you have to remember, it's not COVID infection. Severe, moderate to severe COVID-19, where you need oxygen and hospitalizations. Obesity they have a 20 to 50% higher risk of mortality compared to those with normal weight. Higher obesity class is associated with increasing relative risk of COVID mortality. And obese COVID 19 patients in high income countries had a lower mortality risk than those in middle or low income countries. That's the other thing that they found out. But the main takeaway here is that there is a 20 to 50% higher risk of severe COVID 19 with obesity. Now, remember, as I said, we are not going to see as much severe COVID 19, the lung disease, because that was very specific to interferon, delayed interferon. And now everybody has either been exposed or vaccinated. So that kind of presentation is not really going to happen. But what about some of the other complications with regards to the pandemic? Are those going to happen as well? So, if obesity was associated with severe disease, is it also going to be associated with higher risk of complications, the unusual patterns of disease that we have been seeing over the past few years and is likely to continue for a number of years to come? Let's look carefully at this. The first principle is that my rule, the simple rule that you would probably get from the advanced course, is this: an infection in the upper airway, if it is settled and it doesn't get into the systemic circulation or the bloodstream, is unlikely to cause significant problems. Everything about severe disease was about what occurs when the virus breaks this mucosal barrier and gets into the systemic circulation. That's what drives this cytokine storm with these antibodies. These are lymph nodes. So, very important to note that those people who have protective mucosal immunity are at much lower risk. But you know that even with natural immunity, you can still get infected. And so there is still a risk if the virus breaks into the bloodstream. That's the important point. And that's why it's so significant that COVID is still circulating, especially in highly vaccinated regions, because we know that the immune response in the context of people who have been vaccinated oftentimes is too immune focused and they are unable to control the viral infection. They don't seem to get severe disease, but this is where I'm educating you as to what is likely to happen next. So, there's an important piece of this puzzle that a lot of people don't get. They just don't grasp it. They've never heard of it. They don't know it exists. It's a critical part of the research I was doing with autoimmunity, and it's about free or serum ACE2. Let me explain. When I was looking early in the pandemic and I was trying to figure out why people with hypertension were getting severe disease as the most common comorbidity, and children weren't getting it, or they weren't getting severe COVID-19. That was the data from China. I was trying to find the difference between the two groups. And one of the things that I stumbled into, and so I didn't know about it at that point in 2000 and 2020, so I suspect that many people don't even know this exists, but it is really, really important. Look at this. In the bloodstream, this is the point. In a healthy person, probably in a child, young people fit and active, ACE2, which is attached to endothelial cells, tends to only be attached there. Okay, that's the ACE2. Now, this can be used by the virus to infect the cell. That's fine. That's what it uses in the respiratory tract. So it can cause infection in the lining of the blood vessels of the lung. Okay, but there's an interesting thing that happens in older people, in people with obesity, hypertension, is that, and this is not related to the infection, this is just what happens. This is a physiological response. There's a special ACE2 snipping enzyme, ADAM17, which then clips some of these attached endothelial ACE2s, and they're floating freely in the bloodstream. This seems to be a regulatory mechanism. And so, all that we had said in severe COVID 19 is what happens when it combines with the virus. That's the same question I'm asking now. In people who have elevated levels of serum ACE2 and the virus breaks through their mucosal defense, is there a risk? So, this is where the obesity question comes in, because obesity is critically associated with elevated ACE2. There was a huge study that was done across the world. It coincidentally happened to come out in 2020. So I remember stumbling into this in the middle of 2020, and I said, this is so important. It was just after I realized about ACE2. And again, they were looking at 10,000 people across the world, and again, this is free ACE2 concentration. Now, important to note, this test is not done it's a research tool. So some people say, where can I get my blood test done for this? You can't really. It's really still primarily a research tool. But I guarantee you that this blood test is going to become a standard blood test for everybody going down the line. It's just that the scientific community hasn't quite caught up yet. But what they found is that the levels were higher in males, so sex determines it, ancestry, East Asians and Africans, and here is the biggie, obesity, BMI. The ACE2 is impacted higher with obesity than it is with diabetes, age, blood pressure, or smoking. So, this is the bit that I'm saying to you from an obesity point of view is really, really critical to understand. This is why I'm saying do not underestimate the longer term risks about obesity. Just because we've passed the severe COVID 19 phase, remember, mortality is still up across the world. Nobody's explaining why. It's because we are still having this kind of interaction between virus and proteins ongoing, and it's presenting in different ways. So obesity will still be a risk. Now, here's an important point about the ACE2. This is why I said it's going to become a blood test in time. It's still a research tool. When they looked at the risk of cardiometabolic death, heart disease and so on, stroke and so on, the highest predictor was the serum ACE2 level, higher than smoking, diabetes, weight, blood pressure, cholesterol. I am telling you, in time, this blood test is going to become a standard blood test for everybody over, say, the age of 30 or 40 when they're trying to screen for risk factors. But ACE2 is therefore relevant potentially as we go forward in the pandemic. We really still need to understand what are the risks. This is probably why some people's blood pressure go out of whack after they've had an infection, and they don't know why. And then 3 to 6 months down the line, it's back to normal. But their risks longer term, we have not delineated. We don't know. We don't understand. So I'm going to take you through a few simple things about obesity. And this is again why I'm saying to you is use the link, do the course, invest in the health, because obesity is likely to be longer term risk, not just the usual stuff, but with COVID circulating, it's going to add extra risk. So when we look at obesity here, this is a body mass index chart. Underweight, less than 18.5. This is weight and height. Normal weight between 18.5, 24.9. Slightly overweight is 25 to 29.9. Obese is greater than 30. Severely obese is greater than 35. That's weight versus height. This is quite important when we look at the risks, because when they did the analysis in that study looking at the obesity risk for severe COVID 19, this is what it looked like. So the paper showed that when they looked at obesity as a risk factor for severe disease, and remember, I'm saying it will now be for other things, not just severe disease, that risk factor will exist. When they looked at the mortality among the weight, overweight here was 1.05. So if you're just slightly overweight, you just had a slightly higher risk. But class 1 obesity, that would be more overweight, 1.15, going up to 1.86 for obesity class 3. And that's where it comes back to the people who are severely overweight. But even with being slightly overweight, that risk is still relevant and higher. And the risk goes up the more overweight you are. This is not to be ignored. But I don't want people, a lot of people are trying to lose weight and they're finding that they are struggling. Now, here is the secret sauce, because I'm not saying this just so that people are worried about it. And I am telling you that there are strategies that can be used to impact on it, but you need to understand the science. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of the science, but please just do the course. You'll understand in more detail. Firstly, obesity is a symptom of insulin resistance rather than the cause. Now, a lot of people would have heard this term insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is usually what we're talking about in the context of diabetes, where the body requires more insulin to fix the fact that you've taken in carbohydrates and glucose. And so when you have diabetes, oftentimes there's insulin resistance, and this is why the body can't keep up. And therefore, you need extra help with medication to try and deal with the insulin resistance. Now, what I'm saying to you is that the first symptom of insulin resistance is weight gain. Very important point. So it's not so much that obesity causes diabetes. When you start to gain weight, that's the red flag, and that's what has to be addressed. Here is why, and this is now a little bit of the science, and again, I cover this in more detail in that course. When your body takes in glucose from what you eat, the main place outside of the liver that it's stored is in muscle. And you have muscles all over the body, in your arms, in your legs, in abdomen, and it's stored in the form of glycogen. So glycogen looks like this, these trees of glucose, so that when the muscle needs it, it can quickly break it down and make energy. So usually when you eat, this is what happens. And straight away, it goes straight into glycogen. Everything is put away nice and neat. What then happens is that this pathway is affected in the context of insulin resistance. Now, this is the bit that you really need to understand. What happens is that a lot of people have never even heard of amylin. And if you do the course, you will understand what this is. This is the counter to insulin. Insulin is the gas, amylin is the brake. Most people haven't even heard about it. But amylin is very important in the context of making sure that your blood sugar doesn't go too low. It seems in insulin resistance, it's overactive, and therefore it blocks the production of glycogen. You'll then have a buildup of glucose outside the cells. It won't end up in the muscles, and guess where it will go? Into fat, because that's the other place that insulin operates at to then store the extra glucose, but as fat rather than glycogen. This is so important. I cannot express to you how important this principle is with regards to obesity. If you are gaining weight and you're working out and you are trying and you're cutting your diet and you're just not losing weight, it's pretty likely you've got insulin resistance. You have to fix that. And if you don't address it, you will find that the weight gain gradually increases over time. And as I said, in the context of COVID, we don't have the luxury of people just being obese. This is a comorbid pandemic. It's not over yet. We have to find ways to get people healthier. Part of the strategy is certainly to look at what you're eating, but the other part is to look at managing strategies for improving insulin resistance. That's how you get off the weight. That's how you reduce the risk of obesity. That's how you reduce the longer term risk with regards to what I'm predicting are autoimmune patterns that will present down the line and impact on the lives and the health of people. Very important points, and I hope this wasn't too heavy science. But at the end of the day, the point is simple. Do the studies. I've put together the course, it's there in the description. Please do it. Invest in your health, understand the science. Make sure that you do everything you can to address obesity, because based on the prediction of the science, obesity on its own will put you at risk for longer term complications. Have a great evening.